One thing I always try to stress on this channel is that simplicity isn't necessarily boring. A lot of music content on the internet focuses on stuff that's really technically challenging with fancy chords and difficult rhythms, and don't get me wrong, I love that stuff too. But there's something so impressive to me about a song that doesn't need all that, and one of my favorite examples is the classic Cyndi Lauper ballad Time After Time. Written as a last-minute addition to her debut album, Lauper and her co-writer Rob Hyman didn't have the time for bells and whistles, and they were really careful not to add any. In interviews, they often talked about the temptation to just layer on more new ideas, but they knew what they had was special, and they didn't want to hide that gem by overproducing the track. And this was the mid-80s, so you can imagine how hard it must have been to not overproduce. But instead of trying to fit in everything they could think of, they stayed true to their vision and made a song that contained exactly what it needed and absolutely nothing more. Let's take it apart. The song starts like this. Or okay, there's other stuff happening on top, but it's my video and I want to talk about the percussion first. Deal with it. There's two parts here and they run through the entire song. There's that shaker-like sound on top, which is actually a sample of a Latin percussion instrument called a cabasa, which came as a default sound on the Lindrum sequencer. It was the 80s after all, you couldn't really have a pop hit without some sort of drum machine. Underneath that is a very simple kick drum pattern. And that's it. That's the percussion sound here, and it's the foundation for the percussion throughout the song. And, there's some very obvious symbolism here. The song is about the enduring process of a romantic relationship. The singer and her partner navigate shared difficulties together, and the refrain of Time After Time is a promise to always be there for each other. It places those little struggles into a larger narrative of resilience, and it frames love as choosing to show up, choosing to catch them every time they fall. So while the chords and melodies will change in different sections, and even the percussion takes on some new elements, there's always this constant rhythmic drone to ground it and lend support. In the quiet sections, it takes up a surprising amount of space in the mix, while for the louder sections it fades a bit into the background, but it's always there. And that's what matters. But let's talk about the symbolism of the part itself. And here I'm once again going to borrow my friend 8-Bit's model of drum functions. He breaks the drum part up into three main jobs. You've got the beat, which defines the pulse, the engine, which contradicts the pulse, and the constant, which fills the rest of the space. But here, we've got no engine, and the beat is really sparse, with the kick mostly just playing downbeats. It's clearly trying to stay out of the way, so the obvious choice would be to make the constant slow too. Maybe like quarter note taps on a hi-hat or something just to keep time. But no, instead we get this fairly aggressive eighth note pattern on the cabasa, filling up all the little nooks and crannies of the meter. Left bare like this, with its mechanically consistent pulse and almost no supporting percussion, the line draws your attention to the passage of time. It's too fast to really sound like a ticking clock, but it's getting close to the rush of sand through an hourglass. That contrast between the slow, methodical beat and the driving constant also creates this dull sense of urgency, conveying both the struggles of this relationship and their ultimate unimportance in the face of our protagonist's love. It would have been easy to clutter this part up with more drums. Leaving it bare is a brave choice, and it makes a really bold artistic statement. On top of that, we have the chords. I know a lot of retro synth fans watch my videos, so in case you're wondering, the engineer William Whitman says this was a Juno 60 and a memory Moog played in unison. And they're both using pretty soft settings. There's no aggressive attacks here, so the chords just sort of gently flow into each other, like you'd expect from a ballad. As for what those chords are... Okay, let me get this out of the way. The song's in C major. If you know me at all, you know I'd love to make some convoluted argument for hearing it as some indeterminate shifting key center or something, but as tempting as that is, in this case, I don't really find those arguments compelling. It's in C. That said, it really doesn't want you to know that. Every section has its own little tricks to destabilize and hide that key center, which I'm mentioning now because if we look at the intro, there's no C chord. They don't play it. The progression starts and ends on F major, and in the middle we have a sort of encircling figure where they play the chords above and below that F in order to set up a return to it. You'd think that would make F sound like the root, but even without any other context, I don't think it does, and I think that's because it's a mistake to treat this like a chord progression. These old school synth tones often wind up really emphasizing the top note. If we isolate that, we see the same encircling pattern as before, but this time on C, and this is the line my ear is drawn to when I listen to this section. I have to actively try to follow the chord roots instead, and even then, it's really hard to convince myself to hear F as a point of resolution. To me, this feels less like a progression and more like a harmonized melody, and that melody resolves cleanly to C. This also helps explain the chord choices. If the point here is harmony, we should be asking questions about things like voice leading and chord functions, but there's not much voice leading, and the chord functions don't make a lot of sense. On the other hand, if the point is melody, then we should instead ask about contour, and this is a very contoured line. It breaks up cleanly into two halves, and in each half, all the notes in the first chord move up a step, first from F to G, then E minor to F. That's how we get that encircling figure that gives the line its power. Could they have ended on C major instead? Sure, but that would break the contour, and that's more important than chords. And let's follow that contour as it moves into the verse. Here, one voice does break from the rest. The lower harmony voices hold steady, while the top line steps up to D. This sets up our new contour, a repeated step down from D minor to C. This is played with a push chord pattern, hitting the C early for a little extra metric emphasis, and in case you were still in doubt about the key center, there's also a low C drone in the bass that holds through the whole verse. Honestly, to my ears, it almost overcommits, avoiding a lot of the harmonic motion you need to really establish a key, so while I definitely hear it in C, that tonality is a bit fragile. Like I said, every section hides the root in its own way, and here it's kinda hiding in plain sight. Again, not enough to make it ambiguous, but for the last bar of the phrase, they switch to a new voicing of the C chord that puts the E on top. And despite that being the only time they don't emphasize the root, it feels like the most satisfying resolution in the whole thing because it's actually moving. Building a melody around the third of a key is a great way to draw out the poignant beauty of the major scale, but I'm getting ahead of myself. First, let's look at the actual melody.
Lying in my bed, I hear the clock tick and think of you.
Okay, she's pretty strictly following the top line melody from the synth part. Again, the song is trying to focus on a few central ideas, and if the top line melody is good enough for the synth, why not reuse it for the vocals? Of course, she has more words to sing, which adds some extra syncopation, but the rhythmic pattern laid out by the synth winds up leaving long gaps at the end of each bar and creating a hypnotic sort of ebb and flow that plays perfectly with the lyrics. They use those gaps to insert awkward mid-sentence pauses, carefully avoiding words that could leave the thought sounding complete. Lying in my bed, I hear the clock tick and... You get the idea. You're always waiting to hear the end of the sentence. They do break this in some later verses, but still, starting off with this sort of phrasing gives her a really gentle, tentative quality that speaks again to the passage of time. This isn't a love song about a single passionate moment. It's a love song about forever, and she's got time to choose her words carefully. And that's kind of it for the verse. The only other thing that changed from the intro is that the guitar part disappeared, which... I forgot to mention the guitar part, didn't I? Yeah, Eric Bazillion plays this syncopated figure in the intro with chord stabs on the eighth notes before beats 1 and 3, which adds a little extra rhythmic momentum. It kinda fills the role of the missing engine from the percussion part, but it's transient enough to avoid cluttering the symbolism we talked about earlier. Once the vocals come in and the synth starts playing 2 chords per bar, there's not as much need for that, so Bazillion backs off to keep the energy level nice and low. In later verses, he does add some subtle flourishes in the background, which brings me to my next point. That's pretty much the only thing that changes in later verses. Bazillion does a little decoration, and Lauper does too, but beyond that, the structure is identical. It would have been so easy to bring in more layers to keep stacking things up until the simple beauty of this song was buried in a mountain of orchestration, but they didn't do that. They showed a lot of restraint and trusted the song to speak for itself. Again, simplicity. But there's another side to that coin. If each section is going to be simple on its own, then each section also needs to stand out from the others. That brings us to the pre-chorus, which, for the synths at least, is actually just what you get when you smash the intro and the verse together. We've got the same push chord pattern, but now they're playing those encircling chords, creating a brand new section out of old ideas. Those similarities connect it back to the rest of the song, but since we've never heard them like this before, it still feels fresh and unique. Adding to that are Bazillion's guitar, playing an accelerated version of the intro pattern to match the faster harmonic motion, and Lauper's vocals,
Flashback, warm nights,
which once again follow the top-line melody, another thing we haven't seen in this context, but another thing we have definitely already seen. That's not to say there's nothing new here, though. In the intro, these chords looped, with the F at the end going straight back to the F at the beginning. But here, there's an extra little tag where Lauper sings this,
almost left behind,
and the synths play some kind of random chords to harmonize it. And while I think these chords are mainly here to support Lauper's melodic descent to G, they're also a pretty nice harmonic misdirect. F to G is the start of the loop, but they're also the 4 chord and the 5 chord in C major. The G sus4 gives it even more forward momentum, with that little C-B figure adding some tension and release to the G chord that should be setting up a strong final 4-5-1 cadence. But where we'd expect the triumphant appearance of C, we instead get E minor. On the one hand, that's not surprising. This is what they've always played after G. But on the other hand, it's still pretty sneaky. E minor shares 2 notes in common with C, so we get the entire implied resolution except the root. And they seem to know how unsatisfying that is. The lyrics here tend to be about failure,
almost left behind,
and instead of returning to F like they did in the loop, they sit on E minor for a whole bar to really let it sink in. Anyway, the pattern starts to repeat, playing the first 3 bars again,
suitcase of memories, time after sometimes.
but it gets cut off by the return to the verse, which means I get to talk about hypermeter. This is like normal meter, but bigger. The song's in 4/4, so each bar consists of 4 beats, but in Western music, we really like groups of 4, so we're not just going to restrict them to one rhythmic layer. If we zoom in, of course, each beat consists of 4 16th notes, but what if we zoomed out? What structure consists of 4 bars? Well, that's a phrase. In the intro, the chords took 4 bars to loop. In the verse, the melody and lyrical structure repeat every 4 bars. And at the start of the pre-chorus, the new phrase with the weird chord thing also took 4 bars to play, so an unexpected 3-bar phrase is kinda like if they suddenly dropped a beat. But here, it's even more jarring. A basic rule of hypermeter is that the larger the structure, the less often it gets messed with. We're not used to hearing syncopation on the scale of, like, whole bars. You keep that for the subdivisions. Higher level patterns are much more likely to stay consistent, so this hypermetric time shift feels really confusing, an effect that's amplified by Lauper cutting off the song's title in the lyrics to start a brand new sentence.
Time after sometimes you picture me.
That takes us into another verse, then we return to the pre-chorus with an important new addition, Anton Fig playing a cross-stick snare. This finally gives the percussion a real engine, but it's an interesting one. There's a standard backbeat on 2 and 4, but he's also hitting on beat 3, or put another way, he's hitting every quarter note except the downbeat. This makes it feel less like a backbeat pattern and more like a metronome with gaps, so even with the slight irregularity, it kind of melds with a kielbasa pattern and becomes another pulse that marks out the passage of time. It's still a little too fast to really be a ticking clock, but it's close enough to sound like one. Although it also kind of sounds like knocking, it's a little slow for that, but the gaps in between do give it a sense of someone pounding on a door, demanding to be let in. And that'd make sense. We're finally building up to the actual chorus after all, so the added rhythmic interest of the new layer gives us some much needed intensity. This time though, the phrase ends with a different kind of hypermetric flourish. Instead of starting the loop again and cutting it off, they only play it once, but draw out the ending by repeating the second half.
The second-hand unwind
to give us one 6-bar phrase that stretches out the approach. But we really need to talk about this chorus. The percussion stays pretty much the same. The stems I'm using include an extra snare part and a Simmons tom. but I don't actually hear those in the final song, so I think they probably got cut after recording. Again, the simplicity of this song is not an accident. They spent a lot of time and effort figuring out how many things they could safely remove. Would these parts have ruined the song? No, they're fine, but they weren't necessary. Adding them back in doesn't make it better, so why bother? But let's talk about the things that are there. First, chords. This'll be quick. The basic structure is G, A minor, F, C, which you might recognize if you spent much time dealing with 4-chord loops. This is a version of the famous axis progression, or 1-5-6-4, that shows up all the time in pop songs, especially from the 80s and 90s. I have a whole video about this chord loop. This is an unusual form, though. Typically, the axis progression starts on either C or A minor, or occasionally F. G is by far the least common starting point because it's the least stable. But that's okay because they're not really playing the axis progression. At least, not quite. There's one extra chord in there, and it's a tricky one. You see, one of the problems with this rotation is that there's not really a clear chord root. Typically, in a loop, the first chord sounds the strongest, but here the G is really unstable, and none of the other chords are well positioned to take over for it. To solve that, and to keep the focus on C where it belongs, they add an extra chord to set it up. Kinda. Instead of going straight from F major to C, they do it one note at a time, stepping from A down to G, and then F down to E. So what is this chord in the middle? Well, it's not really a chord so much as it is a voice-leading thing, but still, if I was gonna label it, I might call it F sus2, since it's in the bar that belongs to the F chord, or I might say C sus4, because that's where it resolves. In reality, though, it's neither of those. If we listen to it with the bass, it becomes clear that this is actually meant to be heard as a sort of G chord. That makes it G7 sus4, and it ends the chord loop with something that at least vaguely resembles a classical 4-5-1. The sustained C on top means the resolution isn't quite all there, so again, kinda hiding the obvious key center, but also very clearly working around it. And that brings us to what I consider the main character of this song. The bass synth. It's so cool. It's so cool. And it's so simple, too. In the first bar, it just plays the chord root and waits, then it erupts into this massive octave-spanning A minor arpeggio, with an accent on the 8th note before beat 3, calling to mind the guitar rhythm from the intro. From there, it drops into a more deliberate groove, emphasizing the 4-5-1 pattern in the harmony, before winding back up with a little dance around a D that falls back to G and starts over. This careful interplay of slow and fast sections weaves its way around the vocals, giving space where it's needed and taking space where there's space to take, and coupled with that sharp staccato bounce of the Prophet 5, it feels so much cooler than a bunch of chord roots in one arpeggio has any right to. When you're not doing a lot, it's important to think about how the parts you do have interact, and this clever little dance makes the bass an undeniable star. As for the vocals themselves, let's start with Lauper.
If you're lost, you can look and you will find me. Time after time.
It's a straightforward pentatonic melody with one little twist. There's no C. Anywhere. She sings all the notes of C major pentatonic except the root. Instead, her line pretty clearly revolves around E, the major third. Remember when I said that building a major melody around the third is a great way to draw out the poignance and sadness of the scale? That's because it emphasizes all the minor intervals hidden inside it. In fact, not only do these 4 notes all fit in C major pentatonic, they also fit in E minor pentatonic, and on its own, that's how I prefer to hear this melody. It's set in a major context by the harmony, but it's actually straight up minor, giving Lauper's lyrics a tired, wistful edge. To quote Hyman, it's not a happy song, it's a hopeful song, and this subtle play with a melodic tonality really puts that in focus. Underneath her is the other vocal part, sung by Hyman.
If you're lost, you can look and you will find me. Time after time.
Who starts out in the same pentatonic space, but at the end he steps out and actually lands on C, the real root. This gives us a bit more closure, but since he's still clearly the harmony part, it doesn't subvert Lauper's minor sound. In fact, to my ears, it doesn't even really feel resolved. I kinda hear this as a flat 6 in Lauper's E minor, even as the harmony tells me it's Hyman who's singing the root. And a big part of that is blend. When it comes to background singers, blending is super important. The more similar the voices are, the more they'll combine into one single line. But while Hyman and Lauper were probably never gonna blend perfectly anyway, the truth is, he's not even trying. Hyman recorded this as a scratch demo to play for the background singer they were planning to hire. Lauper just liked it and convinced him to use it in the final track. The two voices are completely disconnected from each other timbrally, which makes them feel less like a single person and more like a conversation. The lyrics aren't just a promise from Lauper to her partner, they're also a promise back to her. We see that musically as Hyman finds the root to support Lauper's wayward melody, and again at the end of the chorus when she jumps up in this sudden outburst of emotion.
If you fall, I will catch you, I'll be waiting. Time after time.
And Hyman responds by calmly holding his line until she finds her way back. It's a really beautiful moment. And that's pretty much it, or at least that's all the big stuff. After the chorus, we get this little interlude over the intro chords with Bazillion taking a kind of solo. But for the most part, the rest of the song is just these same ideas again. And again, I don't think that's a mistake. The fact that the song works so well with so few unnecessary flourishes is a testament to the songwriting and a testament to the confidence they had in the songwriting to just let it stand like that. Time After Time is widely considered one of the greatest love songs of all time, not despite its simplicity, but because of it. It tells a timeless story in a timeless way, with every part doing exactly what it needs to do and nothing more. As an artist, simplicity is one of the hardest lessons to learn, but when it's done right, it's straight up magic. And hey, thanks for watching, and thanks to our featured patrons, Susan Jones, Jill Sungard, Howard Levine, Warren Hewart, Damian Fuller-Sutherland, Neil Moore, Jeff, and Michael Mole. Check out the Nebula Cut for a fuller outro, and as always, keep on rockin'.